all for coming. I know how busy everybody is just now. So the title of the presentation is It Must Be Simple, the Supreme Fiction at the Heart of the Backlash to Access Debate. And so on the opening slide, there's just in the background there's a very abstract looking painting. It looks like it might be a Jackson Pollock painting, and in the front of it there's a very simple figure of a join the dot dog, just to try to illustrate that contrast between complexity and simplicity, which is going to be a kind of a recurring theme throughout the presentation. So my plan was to talk about the different values that tend to be allocated to the different sides of the distinction between simplicity and difficulty, or simplicity and complexity, within the context of aesthetics, and also to look at how this interface gets translated within the domain of art access. And my initial plan was to do that exclusively in relation to some research I did in art galleries in Scotland with visitors with visual impairment, and to kind of contrast the findings of my research with an ongoing debate which has become known as the Backlash to Access debate. But it just seemed too difficult to do that. And also when I was halfway through preparing it, it seemed that I was just looking at one extended argument and contrasting that with sort of input that I have on lots of spreadsheets on my computer, and I thought I might struggle to engage an audience with that. So I've decided to kind of widen out the discussion and to look at, I'm still looking at simplicity and complexity in an aesthetics context and looking at it in relation to disability. But I will be widening out the kind of talk to look at different ways in which this distinction between simplicity and complexity has sort of recurred throughout different parts of my research. And also some of the ways in which I've changed my initial idea have been prompted by different changes to my own practice and my own kind of feelings about my practice that have sort of coincided with my move from Edinburgh to Liverpool. So I thought it might be interesting to kind of share those thoughts with you as well. So rather than being based on one sort of academic paper, this is actually based on an extended work of fiction that I'm currently trying to write, which is very autobiographically informed. So it will be narrated by a fully sighted researcher of blindness and visual impairment. And I'm sort of trying to present it in terms of, rather than looking at one instance of difficulty, I'm looking at it as so many waves of difficulty that I feel are sort of crashing across my career as a fully sighted researcher of blindness. So manifestations of difficulty I'll be thinking about are things like indeterminacy, visual indeterminacy, difficulties of navigation, difficulty of navigating the kind of contrast between ethnography and autoethnography as a fully sighted researcher of blindness. Difficulties that are kind of related to the task of establishing empathy, difficulty that is related to ambiguity, the contrast between difficulty and simplicity as it relates to kind of access and inclusion, and also the different values that are sort of allocated to simplicity and complexity within an aesthetic environment. So as a fully sighted researcher of blindness, I find that I have to be, and at least I do my best to be very mindful of of the potential for sort of, as we call them, sort of power relations in terms of my work with my research partners in Scotland who were visually impaired. And a lot of my work kind of is structured around the idea of different forms of the concept of empathy and looking at different ways in which I might sort of arrive at sort of empathetic understanding within my work. And so Deborah Knight has, in a literary context, she has kind of talked about empathy and kind of difficulty that is associated with empathy. And she talks about it as the sort of understanding we want to achieve involves us in the imaginative reduplication of how things are for somebody else, which is a difficult thing in itself. But when you think about it in relation to the relationship between a fully sighted person and a blind person or a person with visual impairment, there's an extra degree of sort of maybe difficulty there. Mark Patterson talks about it in terms of asymmetric curiosity. He's talking specifically about relationships between fully sighted people, fully sighted researchers and academics, and people with visual impairment. I'm also very mindful, I have a picture on the screen of Gloucester from King Lear. Gloucester talks, after he loses his sight, he uses the expression that he sees it feelingly. And so I'm very mindful that that expression applies to me in a very different way, to how it applied to Gloucester and King Lear. So most people describe empathy as the capacity to understand the experiential frame of reference of another without losing an awareness of its inevitably substantial difference from one's own. So trying to understand another person's experience, but being mindful that that experience may differ from your own in a number of ways. And I'm also very mindful that the kind of academic context within which my work is based is generated from within critical traditions that are derived from the Greek term theoria, which has a lot of connotations of looking and seeing and being looked at, and volunteering insights and making observations and that kind of thing. So it's a very visual charged context that I'm working in, which is problematic in its own way. I'm also, when I undertake my work, I spend a lot of time looking at the difference between ethnographies of blindness by fully sighted researchers and works of autoethnography by individuals with visual impairment, and trying to see how my work fits in within those two bodies of work. I also look at investigations of the phenomenology of blindness by fully sighted research, and then lots of autobiographical accounts of the experience of blindness and visual impairment. And so while I'm trying to navigate these distinctions with my own work, I'm very mindful as well that the work I do needs to be emancipatory, and I'll show you some examples of my work as we progress through the talk. Another thing that I have been keeping in mind since I first encountered it was James Winchester's remark. He's writing about aesthetics, and he says that aesthetic understanding across cultural divides requires sustained, sensitive attention to the worlds out of which the sensibilities in question emerge. So Winchester was talking about the difference between the aesthetic practices of people who come from different cultures, but I think it applies to my work in visual impairment and blindness very well. And so when I look at aesthetics, I'm not exclusively looking at art. I'm primarily interested in how people engage with their environments. Sometimes those environments are art galleries, sometimes they're forests or different types of natural environments. And so I think the concept of aesthetics that is at the center of my work tallies with how somebody like Tanya Tichkovsky approaches disability. So she comes from a sort of an interpretive sociological perspective, and she talks about disability as a space of interpretive encounter and as a way of perceiving and orienting toward the world. So when I'm doing my research or my work, the type of knowledge that I'm after isn't the type of knowledge that you can gain by sort of burning the midnight oil in a library and trying to kind of master a piece of knowledge. It's to do with perception, and it's to do with engagement and orientation. So the knowledge I'm after, it is about perception, but I'm trying to know about something that my research partners with visual impairment know. And about there is quite a big word, because they know it. So the kind of potential hazards of power relations that we talk a lot about, in the way they're generally talked about, they don't seem to pertain in that same way in the work that I do, because I am not the source of knowledge. I'm trying to learn, from my research partners. So, as I say, some of the changes that I have made to my initial idea for the presentation have been prompted by some things, that have happened surrounding my move to Liverpool. One of those things was just a couple of weeks before Christmas. I was at a disability arts event, and one of the disabled speakers was talking about disability art, and she said that non-disabled people just don't get it. The only way they could get it is if they have a happy accident. And I don't know, it shook me a little bit when she said it, partly because of the way she said it and the way it was received. But when I thought about it, I knew, of course, she's right in what she said. But part of me thought that she was sort of doing a disservice to the art that we had all gathered to celebrate, to the capacity of that art and the potential value that it had. But I know that in spite of all of those kind of measures that I've just outlined, in terms of my mindfulness, the mindfulness that I apply to my own research, I never have a feeling that I do get it. But I think another way of looking at it would be to think that if I thought I fully understood art, I probably wouldn't bother going to kind of museums and galleries anyway. I mean, part of what brings me there is that I don't understand it, and I want to explore it more. Another thing that has sort of happened since I came to Liverpool is that when I was working in Edinburgh, I had a very different job, and so I was working on a daily basis with people with visual impairments and with blind people. And so all of this sort of self-reflective research and this mindfulness that I've just mentioned was accompanied by daily interactions with blind people and people with visual impairments, who tended to kind of keep me right, in terms of the direction the research was going. But so far, at least in these early days in Liverpool, this sort of self-reflection exists alone. It's not accompanied by the kind of daily interaction, by the sort of participatory research, and that I'm finding that sort of slightly disconcerting as well. When I was putting this sort of presentation together, I was thinking about David's Embodied Introduction, and I started to think of what this presentation could be called an embodied apologia, coming from a fully sighted researcher of blindness. Because when I was reading about different pieces of work that David sort of encountered, I could really relate to it, because I remember vividly when I first encountered the same pieces of work like Georgina Kliege, her Sight Unseen, John Hull's Touching the Rock. I remember exactly where I was when I discovered these books and the kind of impact that they made in the direction of my research. But in addition to having these works in common, my background, for example, when I was an undergraduate, I focused on aesthetics and also on poetry. William Butler Yeats was a big sort of figure in my earlier study. And so William Butler Yeats, one of his sort of most celebrated poems is called A Drinking Song, where he says that wine comes in at the mouth and love comes in at the eye. That's all we know for truth before we grow old and die. I lift my glass to my mouth, I look at you and I sigh. So he's a very kind of visual, in lots of ways, he's a very sort of visual poet. But also when I was looking at aesthetics, just to give one example of a very kind of a visually charged aesthetician, John Ruskin was kind of central to a lot of the research I did as an undergraduate. So John Ruskin, he's very, at least in terms of his approach to landscape, he's very often aligned with the Romantic poets, except that the Romantic poets like Coleridge and Wordsworth were very mindful of what they called the despotism of the eye, and the fact they were very wary of the fact that the eye was holding their mind in dominion. So they sort of developed this theory of the inner eye as a complement to the outer eye. It's a distinction which is problematic in its own way, but that's another presentation. But for Ruskin, the only thing that mattered was the outward eye. And he's famous for sort of remarks such as that the purest and most thoughtful minds are those which love colour the most. Or he says that nature is painting for us day after day pictures of infinite beauty if we only have the eyes to see them, and that the greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Ruskin was also sort of captivated by the research of a geologist called William Buckland, who spent a lot of time researching the eyes, examining the eyes of trilobites, in order to advance understanding of how, to advance understanding of the level of light that penetrated prehistoric seas. So trilobites were the first sort of creature to have developed a sophisticated visual system. So there's a very visual field of study, and I was very, at one stage I was very sort of preoccupied with Ruskin's preoccupation with this research into trilobites. So I'm just mentioning that because it is a very unlikely grounding for somebody, for a researcher of blindness and visual impairment. The final thing that I want to say is a sort of a preface to the kind of research I'm going to be outlining is, well, it's a sort of I guess you could call it a story about a girl on a Greek island about 30 years ago. When you hear this story, you'll be wondering why I'm mentioning, but I think by the time we get to the end of the presentation, hopefully it will make sense. But there's a Greek girl on an island about 30 years ago. Her father was a sailor, and so he would be away for 6 to 8 months at a time. And she would always be very impatient for his return. But one of the times that he came back, he would always bring her presents when he came back. But one time he came back with some clothes for her, but when she tried on the clothes, they were too small. The sleeves were too short, the legs were too short. So the father told the daughter, "Oh, I remembered you smaller." So I, by 20 years after that, I sort of, I became friends with this girl, and we became quite close. And we were living in Winchester, and then after a couple of years, we moved to Edinburgh. But when she told me this story, I was very curious about how she was as a person at this time when this story took place. And I started thinking about it in terms of Rudolf Arnheim's theory about induced structure, his description of inferences as operations where something is added to given visual facts. So Arnheim talks about when we are presented with sort of basic or elementary organizations of visual shapes, certain electrochemical messages travel towards their final destination in the brain, but in the process they're kind of subject to further shaping until the patterns are completed at various levels in the visual cortex. And in this way, incomplete images complete themselves. He talks about the example where after brain injury, where certain parts of the visual field are blinded, certain types of figures are seen as complete figures, even though they're actually incomplete figures. So I knew this Greek girl. When I knew her, I had something to go on. When I was trying to imagine how she was at the time when this story was told, I had something to go on. And because I used to live on that island myself for a couple of years, I used to teach, a lot of girls that would have been her age, and so I had a lot of things to go on, but I just couldn't sort of complete the picture in my mind. So I'm just going to leave that sort of curious story for now, but I'll come back to it before the end of the presentation. Okay, so as I mentioned, I was living in Winchester. After I'd completed my PhD, I did another master's in museum and gallery access in Winchester. And I did a project there on art walking for my master's dissertation. And so on the screen now I have a photograph of myself with members of the Vega art group in Kent. And we did quite a lot of walking together. And the sort of rationale behind this project was to explore the implications of walking's ambiguous position between art and social practice for its relation to the wider debate about receptions of disability in art and in everyday life. I then moved to Edinburgh, and the first sort of project I did that involved walking was with a lot of young people with visual impairments who were being sort of actively discouraged from doing physical activity in school. We did some kind of forest school education with them, and we engaged them in a lot of outdoor education. But then I became very interested in art walking, and I did a lot of work with a visually impaired art group in Edinburgh, and quite a celebrated artist with a visual impairment called Keith Salmon, and I did a lot of walking with him. So just to give you a brief sort of idea of what art walking kind of entails, it's kind of structured around an impatience with and a skepticism of delimited sets of habitual routes. So art walkers are very sort of distrustful of things like maps, because maps make sort of walking too easy, and we can't wander if we're using a map because we know the direction and we go the most direct route we can to our destination. They talk a lot about the idea of vagabondage and travel, and they regard travel by schedule as false travel. They're very critical of what they regard as the controlling desires of cartography and maps. They also talk about the playful and determined sabotage of the A to Z in the name of what they call errance. So the objective of art walking is very often getting yourself lost, actually, rather than finding yourself. And a lot of theorists who write about art walking talk about how democratic and inclusive it is. And so Andrea Phillips talks about walking's relational and public nature and how it renders it compliant with the ideal of social engagement. Carreri talks about the emancipatory spirit of art walking's rejection of traditionally assigned places that are associated with the arts. And Andrea Phillips again talks about the democratic nature of walking's resistance of regulatory principles and controlling systemization associated with the art world. So they talk this resistance of cartography is kind of very often pitched as a democratic sort of ideal. So there is a resistance to kind of navigational aids that make walking easy. And so it reminds me, just to bring it briefly back to Yeats. Yeats talks in a poem called The Fascination of What's Difficult. He says that the fascination of what's difficult has dried the sap out of my veins and rent spontaneous joy and natural content out of my heart. So the poem suggests that Yeats sort of is kind of inclined towards simplicity and is frustrated by complexity. And a lot of different theorists within aesthetics have said very sort of diverse things about simplicity and complexity. So, for example, Arnheim thinks that simplicity is very important in aesthetics, but it's not enough in itself. Other people think that the sign of a great artist is the capacity to express a very complex idea in a very simple way. And then other people, again, like Ruth Lorand, says that simplicity isn't really an aesthetic category at all. And just if you think about what Yeats says about the fascination of what's difficult, he actually, as he progressed as a poet, he sort of grew to be concerned that his sort of instinctive weakness for visual beauty would be perceived as a sort of blemish in his poetic genius. And when I've written about Yeats, I've suggested that this is where his kind of fascination with blindness comes from. It's almost as a corrective to his kind of weakness for visual beauty. So yeah, Yeats is a very kind of peculiar take on simplicity and difficulty, but I think it is related to what he said about blindness. But I'm not going to get started on Yeats. So just to give you some examples of sort of difficulty in art walking, this fascination with difficulty. So in my research, I've come across lots of different examples of art walking. So for example, one group of art walkers decided to tour one city with a map of another city. That was how they guided themselves. Other people have used what they call generative psychogeography or algorithmic walking. So somebody would just map out an arbitrary series of steps before a walk, and then they would remove themselves to an arbitrary starting point in a city, and just follow the steps and see where they ended up. So completely arbitrary. Also, some people have sort of applied an anomalous fusion of present and past cartography. So they would, so for example, a group of people walked across Copenhagen with a map of Copenhagen which was 150 years old. So it no longer kind of referred to the present layout of the city. And then a lot of people are very interested in soundscapes and sound walks, so maybe they'll go night walking, or they'll go walking sort of blindfolded. So really different ways for imposing difficulty on the process of walking. And again, this is very often pitched as a sort of the most democratic art practice. But if you just contrast that with when I was in Edinburgh, maybe I should say I was sort of marginally involved in the delivery of a habilitation course for people who wanted to guide young people with visual impairments, and a big aspect of that course was navigation, you know, and walking. So yeah, so if you're walking with the visual impairment, the process is it's very often described as a process of encoding, processing, and retrieving information about the environment that you're passing through. So in order to achieve an accurate updating of your current whereabouts in relation to your starting point, you have to develop a capacity for something called path integration, where perceived self-motion is integrated over time to obtain a current estimate of your current whereabouts. You have to be very, very alert to the information that is yielded by passive touch sensing, even, for example, things like the wind on your skin. You have to be able to distinguish between constant and temporary landmarks in your environment. You have to figure out the most efficient way of previewing your walking surface and develop a means of identifying potential hazards. You also have to develop a capacity for distinguishing between what your walking companion, if you have a fully sighted walking companion, what might appear to them to be a hazard and what would actually be a hazard for you. You have to be aware of proprioceptive and kind of vestibular aspects of your motion through the environment, so the coordination of the different kind of parts of your body in the experience of walking, and the importance of balance in walking. You have to be mindful that the auditory system is quite vulnerable to interference in urban areas, and so certain audio cues might be misinterpreted. So you have to be able to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sensory cues. You have to be able to compute the intervening space between locations, and sort of work out the relationship between sort of time and place in terms of distance traveled. You have to be alert to acoustic sound shadows, so the sort of vibrations that are coming from different objects and buildings you encounter on your walk. It's very often referred to as echolocation. You have to develop a capacity for assessing auditory distance, so perception of stationary and dynamic cues while you yourself are moving. Yeah, I might skip a couple of these, but yeah, you also have to kind of understand that walking as a blind person or a person with visual impairment can be more emotionally draining than it is for a person who can see. And then after taking all of these things into consideration, you have to undertake mobility tasks in complex environments in spite of your limited spatial awareness, with grace, comfort, and safety. And I just sort of mentioned these things because they are difficult. And so art walking, what is problematic for the people with visual impairments that I walked with in Edinburgh wasn't the difficulty, the level or the degree of difficulty entailed in art walking, but the way in which that difficulty was applied. And then just quickly, this is one of the mobility risk assessments we used in Edinburgh. So first of all, you have to, if you're doing an habilitation course and you're walking with the child with a visual impairment, you first of all have to identify potential hazards. You have to decide who might be harmed and how they might be harmed. You have to evaluate their risks and decide on precautions. You have to record your findings and implement them. You have to review your assessment and update it if necessary. I'm just, at this point, just going to show you a quick. Last year I made a film about, with an American collaborator called Dan Thornton. I made a short film about a painter, Scottish painter, who has diabetic retinopathy. He's almost completely blind. He sees a little bit out of one eye, but he's a landscape painter, and his paintings are informed by his walks through various landscapes. And we went to an island together, and we went walking, and sort of on the top of a mountain on this freezing cold day, I talked to him about art walking, and just to ask him what he thought about it. So I'm just going to, rather than sort of me blabbering on, I'll just introduce you to Keith, and so you can hear what you can hear his talk on art walking. And remember, he is a very, very experienced walker, and he's an artist.
Which is sort of almost like how I use a monocular in the hills. So I see small little sections, and that quite often when I'm looking around, I see quite abstract sort of compositions because I'm restricting, I'm looking through. And so I tend to get that when I cut bits out on the computer, and I use those quite often as starting points. I'm lucky enough that when I look around, although it's a pretty restricted kind of view I get, I still see magnificent landscape and beautiful things. Now, I may sometimes get the scale completely wrong and think I'm looking at one thing when I'm actually looking at something completely different. But to me, I look around and I see these smudgy bits of the snowy mountains today, and I just sort of see magnificent peaks. Because I quite often say, if we're out walking with people, if you don't really know what I can see, I say, look at that great view. I said, I thought you couldn't see much. Well, no, in terms of perhaps how people with whatever foresight is see, then, it's restricted, but it's still stunningly beautiful, however you see it. But I kind of think that sort of when we're out in a place like this, I couldn't come out here on my own these days, so I have to be with a guide. And the path today is quite a difficult little path, this for me. But with someone who's guiding me that I know, and with care and time, I can move through it relatively safely, probably as safely as any other walker, though I take a bit longer, quite a lot, deal longer. And I could, if we decided we wanted to go up, so long as we weren't going into the snow today, we could go up the hillside off the path, and again it would be a similar kind of thing. In a man-made environment, I find I would then sort of I don't normally walk with someone else, and then walking in a town, in a city. I tend to follow set routes that I know, because I find actually man-made environments quite dangerous in that there's things change rapidly. In the open environment like this, nothing changes, it's all very static. And so getting lost in a town on my own would for me be a lot more dangerous. I tend to find that if I'm walking into town, though basically everything's the same on the same route. I'm listening to things like people putting keys in their car on the drive and turning it and the thing going click, because that means someone's going to reverse out onto the pavement. Little things like that I'm listening to. Obviously, you know, sort of even on a walk into the town, you know, sort of things do change from day to day. You know, sort of you know, they're always digging up the pavement, or someone's leaving something on the pavement. So you can't, you know, sort of go along thinking, oh, everything's exactly the same, because it never is. But generally, if you have a route, you're aware of the potential danger points. That you know where the lampposts are, you know where the crooked pavement is. But you can't go just happily along sort of, and then get surprised when you fall over something. So there's always things you've got to be aware of, but you can relax more than if you're, you know, if I walk somewhere in town that I don't know and I haven't been with Anita, then it gets very, very difficult, because you're not only trying to find where you're going, but you're trying to take in all the potential dangers around you as well.
Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit. So you've got an idea of sort of art walking. When Andrea Phillips talks about art walking, she sort of borrows a term from Mark Cousins, who talks about the weakness of architecture. And when she uses the term weakness, it's not a sort of a derogatory term, but it's an indication of it's weak because members of the public are sort of active, and she calls them cooperative executants of the architecture. And she uses this term when she's describing kind of art walking. So she describes walks as conceptually suggestive interventions which attempt to construct social spaces in which viewers control the way in which the work is read and produced, thereby replacing the authority of the artist with structures of collective decision-making. But when I kind of wrote about this, I sort of questioned the weakness of art walking when you think about it in terms of its accessibility, and when you ask whether or not it is as democratic as she says it is. And I suggested that perhaps walking as art, or art walking, doesn't know its own strength. I'm not going to talk about this now. I might talk to the master's students about it, because one of the obstacles that people impose is kind of darkness or nighttime, or walking with blindfolds. So just finally, when I did talk to people with vision impairments in Edinburgh about art walking, spontaneity is a huge part of kind of art walking, and spontaneity is a really important kind of aspect of everyday life. So we talked about how we might incorporate spontaneity within our art walking, and they came up with a few different ideas. One, so they talked about the idea of method acting, how, so for example, there's a quote on the slide there by Daniel Day-Lewis. He's describing his approach to method acting. And he says that my preference is that the day when someone sticks a tripod in front of you with a camera on the top, it's not day one. It begins way before, with the work before you start filming, and there is no limit to the amount of time that you take to discover a whole life. It could take 6 months, a year, or a lifetime. So Deleuze was saying that it's through rehearsal and through practice that can liberate spontaneity. So by sort of doing a lot of research and practice, on the day of your performance, you can be spontaneous because you're grounded in this rehearsal and you're grounded in your practice. Also, a lot of jazz musicians, like Bill Evans, who's on a photograph on the slide, they could improvise as jazz musicians because they had a grounding in classical music, and it was that grounding that freed them to be spontaneous. And so the people that I worked with in Edinburgh, when they were painting, for example, they would have their different color paints in the same place on their easel, and by just having this small element of order, it freed them to be spontaneous on the canvas. So just I think in a more sort of a more thoughtful approach kind of to artwork, and you could integrate elements of spontaneity within an artwork. Do I have time to just yeah, okay. So one of the other ways in which kind of the contrast between simplicity and sort of difficulty comes into my work is my work in museums and galleries in Scotland with people with visual impairments. And so shortly before I came to Edinburgh, I finished a project where I was using a piece of software called situsin. And on the screen at the moment I have just an illustration of sort of the intended purpose of situsin. So it was really designed to help parents of children with visual impairment know how their children perceive their home environment, so that they would be in a better position to make adaptations to that environment, to make the home more navigable for their children. So on the screen at the moment I have 3 different images. One on the left is just a photograph of a flight of stairs. On the second image is the same flight of stairs, but we have put sort of some sort of black tape on the corner of each step to make the steps more distinct from each other. Oh, sorry, no, that's the third image. The second image is the set of stairs as they are perceived by a child with visual impairment. And then we adapted the stairs by putting black tape on the corner of each step, and then we kind of filtered that image through the visual acuity and contrast sensitivity of a child with visual impairment, so we know how effective the changes can be. So the idea is that it is, you know that by adapting the stairs you make it easier for the child to climb it. So when I came across this sort of software, I immediately thought that it must have an application within a museum and gallery environment. So we were working with lots of museums and galleries in Scotland and getting permission to filter their paintings through the levels of visual acuity of their visitors with visual impairment. I'll kind of talk you through that process in a second. But just looking at it in terms of difficulty, the only other research that I have come across that is kind of remotely like that was some research into what's called indeterminate imagery by Robert Pepperell and Dario Gamboni. So Gamboni talks about potential images. He talks about, well, they both talk about indeterminate imagery, which is art which is suggestive of certain objects, but the objects are presented in a way which resist easy identification. So the objects are kind of obscured to a certain extent, so you know that something is being presented, but you can't quite make out what it is. And Pepperell has devoted over 20 years of his career to kind of manipulating images to try to optimize this kind of balance between indeterminacy and identification. So the idea is that it's connected to what Gombrich talks about the beholder's share, so making the viewer of a painting more engaged in it by making him do a lot of work in order to kind of interpret the painting. So it's making a painting slightly difficult to interpret. It increases the engagement levels of the viewer. But even though Pepperell spent sort of 20 years kind of refining this technique, we can do it like in just a matter of seconds using this software. So just before I tell you about the kind of some of the findings of that research, getting back to the story that you're probably wondering why I told you about, here we have an image of that girl I was talking about when she was at school, and somebody sent me this image kind of last year, and it had a sort of a very kind of big impact on me. It was almost as big as a couple of days previously I had sort of received a phone call to say that she had had a brain hemorrhage, and then another phone call a few hours later to say that she had died. And then it was a few days later, I received this photograph of Jenny when she was at school. So this image that I was trying to sort of imagine in my mind for a long time, suddenly it was presented to me. So it was as if the image I was trying to sort of formulate was completed. And because I used to teach, in the photograph it's a class photograph when she was at school, and so I used to teach classes like this. So I felt that I could come sort of close to sort of conjuring such an image up in my mind. But then I also was sent an earlier photograph of her when she was a sort of very young girl at a kind of fancy dress party. So again, I'm just showing this to you because it's to do with it's a very visual thing to do with the completion of these images that I was trying to kind of conjure up in my mind for a long time. But to me, it's not just a sort of a visual phenomenon. I think about it in terms of what Wordsworth has called cumulative identity. So Wordsworth and people like David Lowenthal and kind of Proust talks about how the people we are now are informed by the people that we were in the past. And so it's not really a visual thing at all. But so the idea was that I was kind of showing you these images because it's connected to the experience of being a fully sighted sort of researcher of blindness and being very often kind of reduced to the sum of the ways in which you aren't disabled, which is a part of my work that kind of I've sort of struggled with for quite a while. And because there's this visual element in my experience and in a lot of what I do, I've sort of decided when I do kind of write this work of fiction that I'm sort of talking about, I'm going to write it from the perspective of one of the trilobites that John Ruskin was so worried about. But on the screen now, we just have an example of the software situsin applied to a work of art. So it's quite a blurred image on the screen because it has been degraded by being filtered through the visual acuity of one of my research partners in Edinburgh. So I don't know if anyone has any idea what is depicted on the screen. Can anyone make it out?
A crocodile.
A crocodile? Almost. So it's a very indeterminate image, which a lot of people would sort of associate with difficulty. This might be slightly easier. It's filtered through a sort of not such a low level of visual acuity. But it's a kind of a seascape. And I think of one more example. So you can see this indeterminacy that Pepperell is sort of trying for so many years to kind of achieve. It can be achieved sort of automatically using this software. And there's a lot of, in disability studies, there's a lot of sort of debate around the idea of simulation as a means of kind of generating experiential understanding. And for years, I generally avoid simulation. But this software was developed by sort of medical professionals and scientists in the NHS, and it is sort of very accurate, and I did find it useful. So the research was also kind of set in the context of what medical professionals have written about art, so ophthalmologists and their kind of take on art, and very often it tallies with what we would call the deficit model of disability. So for example, Michael Marmore has written extensively about Degas and his failing vision, but he has written books where he's trying to draw correlations between Degas's deteriorating vision and the kind of lowering in the quality of his art. So he suggests that Degas's contentment with his late work may be accounted for by the fact that his poor vision may have allowed problems at the easel to fade into smooth shading when he stood back. And also that the failure to see the effects may have led to the acceptance of approaches and imperfections that he may not have otherwise tolerated. So again, so as his eyesight gets worse, his art becomes defective. It's a very sort of negative way of looking at his art. And ophthalmologists do say some very strange things about art. For example, probably the strangest thing I've come across was where two ophthalmologists say that unfortunately there is no further definitive evidence that Van Gogh was ever suffering from glaucoma. So they were really determined to prove that he was, and then they just didn't succeed. So what we did in using this kind of software in an art context, we were trying to address a number of assumptions that are made that are often made, at least when access is provided to people with visual impairments in galleries. One assumption is that every visitor with a visual impairment sees nothing, and the other assumption is that words are capable of doing justice to beauty. And so this has been sort of highly debated in aesthetics in general, but if you think about it in terms of a visitor with a visual impairment to a gallery, very often what they receive by way of access is a verbal description, but the verbal description corresponds to what is perceived by a fully sighted guide rather than what they perceived. And so we were wondering about what kind of impact it would make if we actually structured the access around what the people with visual impairments perceive rather than what their sighted guides perceive. And so in order to do that, we broke the process of aesthetic engagement down into 11 or 12 categories. We measured engagement levels under each of these categories, where we provided access in relation to what the software told us they perceived, or in relation to kind of what the fully sighted researchers perceived. And in each category, the engagement levels went up when we structured the access around their perceptions. In some cases, they went up very significantly. In some cases, it was slightly marginal. But again, coming back to the idea of difficulty, there were a couple of difficulties that we sort of encountered, at least I encountered when we were doing this project. One was, I was really trying to sort of make the participants with visual impairment understand that there was a mutual exchange of experiences of art. So they were telling me about how they perceived the artwork, and I was telling them about how I perceived it. And it was like a sharing of information rather than one person trying to kind of teach the other person. And I really tried very hard to emphasize that, and I really thought it was working until I looked at something called aesthetic testimony, which is the degree to which you're willing to accept and the word of another person for whether or not something is beautiful or ugly or good or bad. And so I did some research into this with a group of participants with visual impairment, about 40 of them, and with a group of fully sighted participants. So I asked them questions about the extent to which they believed me when I told them about sort of information about the life of the artist, or when I told them about the style of the artist, and then when I told them about the beauty of the painting. And just to show you one of the findings was that we asked participants to respond with a number like 1 to 5, and so if they answered 5, they were absolutely prepared to accept my word for what I said. And in terms of the acceptance of beauty, the difference between the degree to which the people with visual impairment were willing to accept my word for whether or not the painting was beautiful or not was in some cases as high as 10 times as high as the degree to which the fully sighted individuals were prepared to accept my word. So I found that surprising and sort of troubling, and it's something I'd really like to sort of investigate further. Another difficulty that we kind of we encountered when we were doing the research was the rules, the kind of accepted conventions of verbal description. So, for example, most of the people who come up with these rules say that you have to be objective at all times. You shouldn't ever volunteer your own opinion about a work of art. But the participants in the research told me that they really like hearing about another person's opinion about a work of art once it's volunteered as an opinion and not as another kind of matter of fact about a painting. So I was thinking about in terms again of Stevens's one of Stevens's poems where he says that when one looks at the sea as one improvises on the piano. And it's very, when you're relaying a verbal description to a person, it's very difficult for any sort of improvisation to happen. But we found the conversations really started to flow and to go in unanticipated directions when we talked about things like opinions and evaluations of the artwork. But so when we were doing it, we took a bit of a sort of a Lord of the Flies approach to the rules, and so we sort of transgressed a lot of the rules, including the rule relating to kind of discussing opinions about work of art. So when I finally collated all of the findings of the research, I put them in context of this debate about the backlash to access, which kind of stemmed from a sort of publication by the Institute of Ideas in London. The name of the publication was Museums for the People, which was, most of it was written by somebody called Jodie Appleton. And she is afraid that by providing access, at least the way we do, we're kind of causing, we're sort of generating a loss of the traditional values of museums and galleries. So, for example, she says that social inclusion is another crusade aimed at transforming the function of the museum. She also says that once a museum puts the perceived needs of the people at the heart of its work, the collection will quite naturally lose its importance and value. So it's an extremely sort of controversial publication, and it has generated a lot of sort of reaction and controversy. First of all, it was from people working within the museum and gallery domain, but then it's sort of other people from outside that domain became involved, and the debates became very, very heated. But they structured around the kind of contention that when we try to engage the public in art gallery, especially in an access context, we have to simplify the art to such an extent that we lose the traditional value of art in doing it. And as you can imagine, there was like a huge debate about it. So one of my responses to that is the question: can value, if you're talking about the value of art, what do we mean by it? I mean, in the museum and gallery sector, value gets attributed to art in all kinds of ways. But I think one of the questions that we need to ask is can value be explored in isolation from the experience of value? Because values are sort of suggested to us through our experience, and value is a property that is attributed to an object by virtue of its relationship to a sensibility. And so, because galleries tend to be publicly funded, we can't kind of rest at just exposing certain sensibilities to the art and then deciding on value in relation to how certain sensibilities respond to art. But my other, and this is where my kind of research tallies in with this debate, is the idea there is an assumption that if you're providing access, you have to sort of dumb things down or kind of simplify things. So one of the final things I looked at in the research project was aesthetic preference. So looking at, because when we were looking at the engagement levels in art, we found, even though we found the technology helped quite a lot, it also became clear that people tend to be more engaged in art that they like and less engaged in art that they like less. So we decided to kind of look at, are there any kind of factors that influence the preferences for the participants in my research for certain types of art over others. So in order to do that, we looked at three 3 aspects of personality, so ambiguity tolerance, sensation seeking, and boredom susceptibility. And we tried to identify correlations between these 3 different aspects of personality with 4 different types of art: simple representational art, simple abstract or surreal art, complex representational art, and complex abstract or surreal art. And there's just some examples of simple and complex art. There's a painting by Anne Redpath and a painting by Alan Davey. But when we compared the responses between visitors with visual impairment and fully sighted visitors, the way they ranked these 4 different kind of categories of art was different. So the visually impaired group preferred complex abstract art over simple abstract art, and the opposite was true of the fully sighted group. And overall, in terms of the appetite for complex art rather than simple art, amongst the visually impaired group, there